Okay. All right. To pull up the notes I put out this morning. All right. I'm going to move on to section 3, which is dealing with the kind of the second major event that kind of overlaps the late Middle Ages, and that's the Protestant Reformation. So, kind of back to kind of like political and religious matters, and a lot of times at this time, politics and religion go hand in hand. You know what I'm saying? So, your kind of standard kind of textbook definition of what the Protestant Reformation is as such, religious revolution of the 16th century. We're talking 1500s. 1517 is generally the beginning of the Reformation, although there are events and individuals that lay the foundation before somebody like Martin Luther comes to the forefront. But the whole idea is to kind of remember at this time there's really only one game in town when it comes to religion and churches, and that's the Catholic Church, right? So this challenges the supremacy of the papacy, the popes, right, as well as the Catholic Church, and this kind of monopoly that the Catholic Church has on people's souls and salvation. Now, there's like when you kind of just like unpack the term Protestant, like the word Protestant, what word kind of jumps out at you? What's the first part? Minus the ant. Protest, right? When you protest something, you're basically kind of you're vocalizing grievances and stuff like that. All right, and then in Reformation, what word jumps out? Reform, right? Okay, so the reform to change it. All right, and so there are people in the past I talked about that were kind of like basically kind of protesting and asking for reform for the church, like in the Great Schism. I talked about two guys, John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia, that were very critical of the church. All right, during the kind of the Great Schism, and basically some of the same ideas Luther is going to kind of advocate for. So before we get to 1517, in like the late 1400s, early 1500s, there's other people that basically kind of vocalize grievances, use satire as a means to kind of challenge the church, and basically kind of like Luther is going to kind of like benefit from. One is an unlikely figure. This is a guy who's in the heart of the Renaissance in the late 1400s, and that's a Dominican monk by the name of Girolamo Savonarola. Now, Savonarola was basically claiming that the church in particular, he was very critical of the Pope at the time, who was Alexander VI, who's one of the more corrupt popes that we've had in history. He was the Borgia. You ever at Showtime, they had a whole series on the Borgias. And he was the one who had a wife and a mistress that was basically kind of an unspoken, everybody knew. He had a son that became a cardinal, another son that actually killed his sister's husband in public. All right, so he was open fodder for that type of criticism. But Savonarola was even arguing that those in Florence had kind of gotten away from their kind of piety, religious piety and stuff. All right. Also, he was claiming to be a prophet. He was saying a storm was coming through northern Italy. And he said a new Cyrus was emerging. Cyrus being Cyrus the Great, that would kind of liberate those who were like true believers, like himself and others. So. Ironically, what had occurred here was this would also mark the invasion by the French king Charles VIII. Now, Charles VIII wasn't coming through northern Italy to basically free true believers or whatever. He was coming through northern Italy because he had to get to Naples, and he's basically claiming his basically inheritance to the kingdom of Naples, right? But there was no internet, there was no TV, there was no radio, and people, when they just saw that Charles VIII came through, they were like, "Oh my God, he's right." So he became the kind of de facto leader of Florence after Lorenzo de' Medici dies, and the Medicis are kind of kicked out of Florence. So he encourages people to get rid of their kind of like unnecessarily kind of like secular possessions, and he encourages them to burn like clothing and jewelry and art and stuff like that. That's referred to as the bonfire of the vanities. Something like Botticelli, who I talked about, was kind of came under Savonarola's kind of spell. And unfortunately burned a lot of his paintings. Luckily, we still have some like Birth of Venus and La Primavera left. So there's Savonarola, right? However, he's only going to be in power for about 4 years. He wears his welcome out rather quickly, which a lot of these despots kind of do. And in 1498, he's put on trial, and him and a small group of his kind of followers were burned at the stake. In Florence, I was there in 2011, there's like a little disc that marks the very spot in which he was publicly burned at the stake, and this is right in front of the main plaza, the Plaza Vecchio there, the Signoria, which is like kind of city hall, and to make sure that his remains were completely incinerated, They burned his bones. They essentially threw the ashes in the Arno River, so nobody would kind of use him and like go visit his relics and stuff like that. But Savonarola did have some points that the Catholic Church was corrupt. That also at the time the Pope was trying to force Florence into an alliance called the Holy League against France, and Savonarola felt that wasn't in their best interest in that, so he felt that the papacy was too forceful. All right. Now, two other guys are going to do a little bit softer stuff than Savonarola. One is in the Netherlands, a guy named Erasmus. He's considered a humanist. He actually translated the Greek Testament, basically in the New Testament in Greek. He's a staunch Catholic. He's advocating for more reform, and he does something by using satire. So he writes a kind of a series of essays in a collection referred to in Prince of Folly. Folly means foolishness, all right? And he skewers, makes fun of every aspect of society, but he has particular disdain for the Catholic Church, and particularly like the clergy. Like there was one thing talking about how like there was like a number of priests who were illiterate. The problem is that priests in the Catholic Church states that the Bible needed to be interpreted by a church official, all right? And so there's some kind of criticism with that. Also, the use of simony and kind of greed that's kind of associated with this. So Erasmus is using a little bit of softer stuff, but Erasmus is advocating for basically kind of reform, right? This is his portrait painting. This is painted by Hans Holbein, who I talked about yesterday, who was Henry VIII, essentially his portrait painting. He's going to influence one of his good friends, Thomas More, who is going to write a book called Utopia, which is basically combining two Greek words that mean basically no place. But this is where the definition of a utopian, like you've ever heard of the utopia, the idea of kind of a perfect society. He writes this book about this place where it's essentially just kind of like, it's the exact opposite of what's going on, like with the church and other, this is an ideal perfect society. More actually dedicates Utopia to Erasmus because he wrote most of it. While staying with Erasmus. Right. More is a lawyer, but he's also like Erasmus, a very kind of devout Catholic and church official. He's famous actually for later becoming the chancellor for King Henry VIII. The chancellor did a lot of the kind of political kind of maneuvering that was necessary. However, More is going to wear out his welcome with Henry VIII when he publicly criticizes Henry's need to or desire to get a divorce. This is a painting also by Holbein, which shows More. He's the patron saint of lawyers. Right? They made a play about him called Man for All Seasons. Right? But these guys are able to kind of get their word out because there's a relatively new invention when it comes to mass media, and that's the printing press. And it was in the mid 1400s, where the printing press, with the guy who's kind of credited as the inventor, Johann Gutenberg in Germany, becomes popular. Gutenberg was a kind of a goldsmith by trade, so he uses like an old wine press where you kind of crush grapes in that. He creates these plates where you can basically kind of mass produce kind of like productions of kind of written works. The concept of what we call block printing, as it's known, actually has its origins in China. But like in chapter 8, we were talking, in China it was kind of hard it wasn't popular because to wood block print, you'd have to have a whole bunch of characters because Chinese Mandarin is a kind of a whole word language here. All right. So there's, I guess like Google, whenever you kind of like go on to Google, they always have like, what they call them, doodles in front. Like yesterday was Luther Vandross's 70th birthday, so they had something there. Last week, Gutenberg was the topic of that. And so this is what Gutenberg has done. You can make a direct line from the printing press to the internet. This is the origins of mass media. All right. So there's Gutenberg next, kind of like bearded kind of part there. He's got. This is a replica of the kind of the printing press that he had used. Like I said, it was initially kind of old wine press. And then one of the first mass-produced books was the Bible, obviously. And I think there's a few places that have Gutenberg's Bible. I know in D.C., I think at the Smithsonian they have one. I think there's one like in Loyola University in New Orleans. I think they have one. Now, how does the Reformation kind of like help create, or at least kind of aid the printing press, I should say, help aid or create the Reformation? One, if you guys know anything about economics, is that if you mass produce something, things become a little bit cheaper generally. All right. Prior to this, people like in Europe were basically handwriting kind of texts and manuscripts and books and stuff like that, and hand copying that. That can be very arduous and take very long, and so as a result, you didn't have a lot of books. When you make books cheaper, that does kind of boost kind of literacy rates and stuff like that. ideas can spread more quickly. Like I said, this is a prime example, very similar to, let's say, kind of like the internet that is today. All right. Ideas that, like, which were generally kind of localized can now become more regional, right? Also too, and when it comes to the Reformation, more people could interpret the Bible if you could read, right? And that was the thing that was challenging the kind of church doctrine, where you had to have a church official interpret the Bible for you. And then a lot of these books kind of encourage popular piety, encourage kind of religious, kind of like, kind of devotion and such. So, this is going to aid, if not create, the Reformation. All right. And so technology, how it is just basically kind of improving things. Technology plays a big role in kind of spreading this kind of this concept out. All right. Now, like I said, the guy who's usually credited with starting the Reformation is Martin Luther. Right. Luther is one of these unlikely figures in world history to kind of start a revolution. Luther is a German monk. He's a professor of theology at a place called Wittenberg. All right. Now, initially, he was supposed to be studying to be a lawyer, but there was a story, and I don't know if it's a legend here, where Luther was caught in a thunderstorm, and he became very scared. And the story was they prayed to God to get him to safety, and that he would devote his life to God, and he does. And to his father's dismay, he becomes a monk. Luther is very outspoken. He's critical. As a professor, he tends to have a lot of opinions and such. There was an incident in which he goes to Rome on pilgrimage, and he comes to find that he's every time he goes, he pays to see relics or these various things. And there's constantly the church nickel and diming people, right? And this idea, there's so much wealth in the church. They're collecting tithing. They're having people even donate more money. What is it all for? And then the church has this kind of fundraiser, if you will, to basically raise money to finish the dome on St. Peter's Cathedral, which was designed by Michelangelo, right? So there's a Catholic friar, German Catholic friar in the area named John Tetzel, who's trying to raise money for this. And Tetzel does this through some kind of some questionable sales tactics, right? And Luther just basically has enough of that. So there's Martin Luther. All right. And so what Tetzel is essentially selling are these things called indulgences, which are these certificates that initially are pardons for, so for example, if anybody's raised Catholic, one of the sacraments that you go through is confession. So you go to confession to a priest, and you basically sit there and you go into a booth. Sometimes not face-to-face, but you go to a booth, there's a screen that separates you, and you basically bless me, Father, prior sin. It's been 10 years since my last confession. Since then, I've murdered a hobo. And so the priest is supposed to say, I'm here to do 10 Our Fathers and a couple Hail Marys, and that's your kind of penance or whatever. My brother, when he did his before first communion, apparently told the priest that he committed adultery. Now, normally the priests are supposed to keep that kind of close. They're not supposed to tell that, but he thought that was kind of funny. And so the idea of indulgences, how they were initially kind of planned. The indulgences would basically exempt you from the Hail Marys and Our Fathers. What Tetzel starts to do is basically makes it sound like it's exempt you from the sin. All right. So what that means is basically you can buy your way into heaven to a certain extent. All right. And that really upset Luther. All right. And so and Tetzel raised a lot of money here. All right. And so what you would do is, and this is kind of unclear, you would get these certificates. So I'm not totally sure, and the cross keys and they kind of represents the papacy. So it's legit, and Tetzel's name's kind of found at the bottom there. I don't know, if you would be buried with these, or you go to heaven and you'd be here, I'm exempt from all the things that I did. It's a little unclear. But again, people are, sometimes people kind of try to scam people to a certain extent. So Luther is finally, he had enough. So he puts pen to paper and basically kind of writes his kind of his grievances. Initially about indulgences, but then other things about the church. And those are famously referred to as the 95 Theses. All right. Now, what he does is on October 31st of 1517, he goes to the main cathedral, the Catholic Church there in Wittenberg, and nails these to the church door. Now, we have this impression that basically the sees part and he does it and everybody's walking. It's not the case. All right. In a college town like Wittenberg was, the cathedral, the church door was kind of big bulletin board. What ends up happening, and he writes initially out in Latin because it's a college town. So what ends up happening, somebody takes this and they take it to a printer. All right, eventually it gets translated into German, and come to find out it becomes mass produced. So that's where a lot of times they say if it wasn't for the printing press, probably the Reformation wouldn't happen. It would probably just be like just very localized in Wittenberg. You got one professor who's basically very critical of the church. As a result of the printing press, this becomes something much, much larger, right? And this is kind of like a copy that they put in the text here. Now, we're not going to go through all the points here, but the kind of main ideas of the 95 Theses. And some of these are not anything necessarily new. A lot of these ideas are the same ideas that Huss and Wycliffe had. Salvation by faith alone. By meaning your entrance into heaven should be based on the fact that you are a believer, and that is it. That is it. Right? You shouldn't have to pay for your way to get into heaven. Right? The Bible, the only authority for Christian life. This is something taken from Wycliffe and Huss, the idea basically like the Bible should be the final authority. But to Luther, the Bible is the only authority, meaning that the Pope's interpretation of the Bible is irrelevant. It's the Bible itself. All right. And with that, you don't necessarily need anybody to basically kind of like decipher this for you, interpret this for you. If you are literate and you can read the Bible, you can do this for yourself. So that's our concept of priesthood for all believers. All right, taking these kind of like priests and these kind of church officials out of the equation here. All right, so these are ideas like that seem very, it's not that big a deal. But back then, you got to keep in mind, people, this was essentially challenging the authority of the church and the idea of like your salvation, your eternal soul. All right. So with it being mass produced, we come to find out in places like in Germany, there was a lot of people that kind of agreed with Luther. Right. And so a lot of people were just like, you know what? Yeah, I do. There's a lot of money that leaves this area that goes to Rome. What does it go for? You got to keep in mind, the Pope at the time is Pope Leo X, the Medici, who has his own white elephant, right? Hanno. So you're looking at this dude who's basically spending money on lavish things and having Raphael paint his portrait and that. People look at it and say, well, really, what the church has kind of lost its way to a certain extent. Now, one guy that's not a fan of Martin Luther happens to be probably the strongest monarch in Europe at the time. That's Charles V. Now, Charles V, as a Habsburg, remember the Habsburgs had that tendency to marry into various royal families. As a result of these marriages, he is the King of Spain as well as the Holy Roman Emperor. All right. And so Charles V is a devout Catholic. So Luther is basically kind of challenging his kind of like religious belief, but also he's challenging his rule because he's challenging the legitimacy of the papacy. All right. And for Charles V, particularly as the Holy Roman Emperor, his title comes from the fact that this was something that was created by the papacy, if you will. All right. So Charles V finds that this guy is like this kind of mass information gets out can be a challenge to his rule. Right, and you find a number of kind of like German princes, particularly in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, that like what Luther is saying. All right, so this is Charles V. His portrait, this was the one that was painted by Titian, who I talked about the other day. Remember I was saying like the Habsburgs who had that tendency to marry the royal family, stuff like that. You see that kind of the very pronounced jaw. They call it the Habsburg chin or Habsburg jaw. It's kind of like Jay Leno to a certain extent. You definitely see that in Charles V. All right. So what ends up happening is Charles V, along with the Pope Leo X, basically call Luther in front of a tribunal in a German city called Worms. All right, and so Luther, before he goes to Worms, has to get, tries to get like kind of assurance that he is not going to be burned at the stake like Huss is. All right, and so he gets that concession. And so what ends up happening is basically kind of like Charles V and Leo X basically believe that Luther is going to basically kind of just basically rescind everything he says. Go back, and to Luther's credit, he does not. He sticks to his gun, right? And he says, may God have mercy on my soul, but this is what I believe, right? This is an unlikely figure. Like I said, this is a guy who's just a professor. He's just a kind of a monk. He's not anybody like a bishop or anything like a cardinal that basically just essentially challenges the two most powerful men in Western Europe at the time. However, Luther, when he leaves, the Edict of Worms is issued, basically declaring him a heretic and an outlaw, and he's a man on the run. Meaning if he's captured, he's going to be burned at the stake. However, he is never captured and basically lives out the rest of his life writing and preaching for about 25 more years. All right. The reason being is that he has friends in high places, so to speak, more powerful people. This has been presenting his case in front of, right there's Charles V, and then there's Leo X. All right. The one man that is kind of instrumental in basically kind of saving him is this guy, Prince Frederick III of Saxony. He's also known as Frederick the Wise. Wittenberg is in Saxony. And Frederick is a fan of Luther, not necessarily for religious purposes, because Frederick, for all accounts, is a devout Catholic. And it's kind of unlikely that him and Luther would have this kind of relationship, because Frederick claimed to have the largest kind of personal possession of relics, right? Which relics were remains and the kind of religious kind of items, like remains of saints and stuff like that. Like Frederick claimed to have like the forearm of St. John the Baptist. He claimed to have a piece of the true cross that Jesus was crucified on. And he also claimed, I don't know how the hell you get a hold of this, to have the breast milk of the Virgin Mary. All right, Luther was very critical to the point of almost kind of making fun of the whole use of relics. But to Frederick, Luther was this political wedge that he could use to basically stick to Charles V. And a number of basically German princes in the northern part of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, liked that Luther was there. All right, so he gives Luther sanctuary. One of his castles, Luther basically translates the Bible into German. All right, and this is where the language of German, modern German language, starts to change a little bit. All right, and so Luther is basically kind of given sanctuary and allowed to basically stay alive and to thrive because of people like Frederick III. And there's Frederick right there. All right. Now, what ends up happening is that Luther, as the edict confirms, is declared a heretic. He's excommunicated as well. All right, by Pope Leo X. Instead of that being a death sentence, Luther's well, I'll just kind of create my own church. All right. And so what ends up happening is a new church that is basically the first time the Catholic Church is really being, in Western Europe, is really being challenged for people's souls and salvation. And so we start to see the first Protestant denomination, which are Lutherans, or considered the first Protestant. All right. And Luther, there's some certain aspects of the Lutheran mass that are very similar to Catholic Church, but there's definitely differences in appearance. Lutheran priests tended, you saw the image of Luther, tended to wear black, very, very understated. That was a conscious decision because we'd see popes and cardinals and bishops and that wearing bright colors and jewels and stuff like that. Lutheran priests were also able to marry. Luther himself gets married at this time. His wife was actually a nun who was smuggled out of a convent with some other nuns in pickle barrels. All right. So it's a little bit progressive in that sense. All right. And so later, this is good. We're going to see other churches, I'll talk tomorrow about the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Swiss Reformed churches, all that start to emerge out of this. All right. And like I said, Luther is going to be, he's going to find a lot of followers, not just the powers that be, but also common people, all right, that are going to not just use him basically for religious purposes, but as an inspiration to challenge the powers that be. And so what emerged here are these peasant revolts in 1524 and 1525 that are using ideas of Luther to challenge the things of the very tail end of feudalism here. All right, as we're getting then, we still see the the vestiges of serfdom and stuff like that. So you would think Luther would be a big supporter of this, fall in with his ideas. However, he is not, and he writes a number of essays and letters basically critical of those who are basically revolting against people like Frederick the Wise and these other German princes. All right, he makes a political calculation here because the people that these people are revolting against are the same people that are basically giving him refuge. All right, he has a letter in which he says that you are to put down your arms or put down your weapons, and basically you need to serve both your master in heaven and your masters on earth here. All right. Another thing that somewhat people tend to look at the criticism of Luther is that at the time he thought Jewish people would basically convert to Lutheranism. When that's not the case, he writes some very critical letters. There's one letter that's somewhat controversial where he talks about advocating for the burning of synagogues. All right. But again, that's not something that is inherently in Lutheranism, and you have Catholics that were at the time that were anti-Semitic as well. Whether you're a Lutheran or not, you have to give it up to the dude because he basically stuck to his guns. All right, like I say, one of these unlikely figures that's going to change history, if you will. All right, but the peasant revolt and his ideas on Judaism tend to be the things that people are critical of. What we start to see here is a split within the Holy Roman Empire, where you find princes in the northern half of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany that are gravitating towards Lutheranism. And in the southern half, Bavaria, places like that, they remain staunchly Catholic. And this is threatening to divide the Holy Roman Empire up. So a a diet, which are these meetings that are held within the Holy Roman Empire, is called the First Diet of Speyer, 1526, basically makes to a compromise, allowing for German princes, particularly the northern half, to practice Lutheranism in one. However, what ends up happening here is that Charles V does not sanction this. So he calls for a second diet in the same city, in Speyer, and reverses that decision. And we start to see there's a lot of conflict here between Protestants and Catholics. A lot of times people started this the beginning of what they call the wars of religion in Europe that come to a crescendo in the 30-year war, the late part of the 1600s. All right. So tomorrow what I'll talk about is basically the emergence of great Protestant churches in places like Scandinavia and Switzerland and England, Scotland, France, places like that. Did you guys get this at home?
Yeah.
Cool.